everyone, Todd Shelnut back with CFI Pro Courses, and today we're going to be concentrating on our second installment for lesson plan training. Now, the first time we talked about lesson plans, we specifically looked at the lesson plans that you would use in the ground portion of your training. But today we're going to look at the lesson plans that are for the in-flight portion, or for the maneuvers as we like to call it. So stick around for this. Be a nice, exciting video today. Nice, short, and sweet as I walk you through step by step how to design that lesson plan. Tune in the first of next month where we'll also go over the scenario-based lesson plan, whichever you prefer to say, and that'll kick off our month of March. So without further ado, let's get started. All right, so the first thing that we always want to do is have our resources out. So what I have out today to be able to design this lesson plan is my airplane flying handbook here, and I'm going to be doing a lesson plan on 8s on pylons, which is located here on page 6-14 in the airplane flying handbook. And I've also opened up my Google Drive and I started a fresh new document, and I'm going to label this the name of my lesson plan. Once the file name is complete, I can go ahead and start with my standard layout that we discussed in our last video. So as you can see here, I've loaded up our standard layout, and it's going to be a little bit different from our ground lesson because things can actually be a little bit different. Sometimes you don't need all the things in the airplane that you need in the ground portion. So I start off just like this. Now, the very first thing I like to do, as with any lesson plan, is I have to design the lesson objective first and the completion standards second. Once I do that, everything will fall into place the way I need it to for my lesson, and I'll be able to develop my content along the way while I'm trying to develop my completion standards. So the first thing I want to do is go to the airplane flying handbook. Now when I do that, if you'll look, you can actually see in some of these maneuvers, it will actually tell you why you need to do this. The first thing I want to work on is my lesson objectives. Why am I here? So if I go to my source code and go to restart reading 8s on pylons, you can actually see that there's even a sentence right here that actually starts that says the goal of 8s on pylons is this, and then down here it says all these other reasons that 8s on pylons is the most advanced and difficult thing, and blah blah blah. And if you read through it, it's incredibly simple to develop the objective. And if you don't understand the objective, then you need to go find another resource that would be able to help you understand what the objective is. But 99.99% of all the maneuvers that are done with the FAA, their objective is clearly stated in this handbook. So I already know what I want to do with the objective, so I've already developed it. Let's go ahead and drop it in here. Okay, so I have my objective dropped in on my lesson plan, and the next thing I need to do after I do the objective is to figure out how or what do I want the student to be able to accomplish at the end of the lesson, and that's going to be my completion standards. So I've got my objective designed, and the next thing is the completion standards. Now, of course, I've already developed my completion standards. I just simply need to drop them in on the lesson plan. Let's go ahead and do that now. All right, so you can see here that my completion standards state that at the end of the lesson, the learner, which is the student, will be able to identify proper pylons, compute pivotal altitude, and have an understanding of the proper initiation of the entry maneuver and exit while maintaining coordination and situational awareness. And this is a very basic completion standard for a lesson. It's not something that's relatively complicated to design. It's basically where do you want your student to be at the end of the lesson. But what I have to ask myself is this. I know what my objective is, and I know what my completion standards are, but like we talked about with the last lesson, how do we get to that particular point? And this is where the content comes in. Now with the content, I have some other items that I like to drop in these boxes. It's kind of like sub-content of content, and I'm going to go ahead and drop those in, and then we'll talk about each one. Let's do that now. All right, so I have my sub-content posted in here in regards to what I want to talk about, and this is where it's going to lead me to designing those completion standards. What do I need to do to get to those standards? Well, I like to start off always by talking with my maneuvers about the pre-flight discussion. What am I going to do first in regards to the flight? And this is almost a repetitive thing every flight. Normally the pre-flight discussion is relatively uniform throughout all my lesson plans. Of course, I've already designed it. Let's go ahead and drop it in, then we'll talk about it. So you can see here that I have in my pre-flight discussion for me to talk about the lesson objective and completion standards, which is located above. I also want to talk about my normal checklist procedures because I like to instill those practices very, very young to my students, and whenever I have advanced students come, make sure they understand that checklist procedures are number one priority. The next thing is to talk about the weather analysis, especially if we are actually going flying that day. We want to make sure that we have the proper VFR weather minimums and cloud clearances to perform the maneuvers, and this is going to help me to instill this upon the student very early on in training or to reinstill it for a person who's doing advanced training. The next thing is the review, and the review is what am I going to do on this lesson? Now this layout that we have here is 100% completely out of the Aviation Instructor's Handbook using Chapters 4 and Chapter 6. And the review I want to do is basically the backbone of the lesson. Now, I've already thought about it. Let me go ahead and drop it in. So the first thing I like to do in the review is to go ahead and state the purpose. This is important to me because the Aviation Instructor's Handbook says I should always make sure that my student stays incredibly motivated and that they understand the reasoning why they have to learn this material. So I have to really stay pretty keen on the purpose of the maneuver and of the ground lesson, whatever I'm doing, throughout the lesson, so that way the student stays motivated and will not become demotivated. So after I do that, I talk about all these items here as I normally would. Again, as commercial pilots, you already know about all this information. There's no need to go into detail about what each one of these items mean. You can simply just go over to your airplane flying handbook and read everything there is that you would ever need to know about pivotal altitude and pylons and everything else there. So I'm going to let you save that for your own time and read that. But this is what I would go for the review. Now the next thing I have is my introduction. And in my introduction are going to lie the items in which I'm going to do in the flight portion. Now, of course, I've already designed those. Let me drop them in for you. So as you can see here, the introduction is relatively simple. It just basically states that the instructor will perform the maneuver and then allow the learner or the student to try and perform the maneuver, and that the instructor will provide guidance, positive guidance to the learner throughout the maneuver. So the introduction is how I'm going to go out in the aircraft and actually introduce this to the student. This can get pretty much elaborate. Pretty much every one of these columns can get elaborate, but right now we're just looking at designing your first lesson plans, and they don't need to be elaborate. It just needs to have a rough core layout of how you plan on conducting your business as a flight instructor. Lastly, we have here's the post-flight discussion. Of course, I've already designed it. Let me drop it in. So as you can see here, our post-flight discussion is going to deal with critiquing the learner's performance. And we're going to preview the next lesson and give a study assignment. Again, very, very broad. So this may be in your eyes very broad, but what we're actually looking at here is to make sure that as a designer of these lesson plans that you can actually go through this pretty quick and get your inventory of lesson plans completed. That way you can go ahead and start tweaking on them. You can't spend 2 weeks at a time for each lesson plan. Most of you are going through pretty fast courses and you simply just don't have that kind of time. Now, if you have that kind of time where you can spend 2 weeks on 8s on pylons, that's up to you. I can't say whether or not that's a good or a bad thing, but for here, this is going to satisfy the FAA requirement for that. And this is a very, very simple way to design these lesson plans, and I think you could probably design anywhere from 10 to 15, maybe even 20 a day just by using this technique. Now, overall in the CFI PTS, there's probably around 96 lesson plans that you would have to design, give or take 1 or 2. And you could easily do this in a few days and have all of your lesson plans done if you follow this technique. Now, one of the things I want you to understand is that this is a beginner's lesson plan. So is there such thing as an advanced lesson plan? Actually, there is. Let's take a look at one of those and see what you think about it. All right, so what we have here is a more advanced lesson plan. This is something that is incredibly complete. It's very thorough, and let's go through this. So the very first part of this lesson plan is actually going to be the in-flight portion, and it covers a lot of the things that I told you that you could leave off. The reason why it does is because, again, this is a very advanced lesson plan. It is not a basic lesson plan. This is for someone who has been doing this for a while and knows exactly what to look for. But as a person who's just creating lesson plans, you don't have that information. That's why lesson plans are a living, breathing object that the better that you get as a flight instructor, the more you can modify them and the better they can be. So as you can see here, I have my objective, which is a little bit more detailed, the content that I want to be able to explain, my equipment that I want to have in front of me when I'm doing it. I want to have my schedule, what I should plan on that day to be able to do this, what the instructor has prepared for, which is me, what the student should prepare for, and the completion standards. And then I've also done a more or less almost like a ground school or some notes after that. So these are the notes for the flight portion that we're going to do. And then I have a dedicated thing here just for the ground portion. So after I finish the ground there, then we go over it. I have the armchair flying, the common errors, and I also have a list of questions that I like to ask at the end. So this lesson plan here is very thorough. Again, I will put this down below so you can print it out and look at it and try to develop something like this for yourself eventually. You don't have to do this right off the bat. That's not what the FAA is looking for. They just want to know how you're going to do it. So if you have any questions, again, please post them down below. This purpose of this lesson today is to show you how to create a basic maneuver lesson plan. I've also showed you how to create an advanced lesson plan, which is included with the video today. And hopefully you can see here that this is a little bit different from, some people say it's almost easier than what you would do in regards to the maneuver. So again, I have run through this relatively quickly, and I'm hoping that I didn't leave anything out for you. And I hope that you understand where you're supposed to go with this. But again, the good thing about being a member of the Patreon and on my paid YouTube channel is that you get to ask me anything that you want to ask me. So please make sure that you go ahead and think about this and look at it, and anything that you have, post those questions down below, and I'll make sure that I answer you as quickly as possible. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm Todd Shellant with CFI Pro Courses. Bye-bye.